How's it going, guys? This is Trey Bell, and this is Arcane Frequency. I am here again with Jonathan Critford. How you doing, Jonathan?
I'm very well, Trey. It's nice to be back after a couple of months of a layoff. Everybody out there, hope you've had good holiday season and a good new year. Trey and I have both been quite ill, so
Yeah,
it's good to be back. New topic for you as well today. We're discussing Coil, quite a logical extension from Current 93, I think. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting one this because I'm I've been a fan of Coil for a while, but I'm not as familiar with their complete body of work as I am with Current 93. And I understand you're fairly new to Coil, Trey.
yeah. I- in a weird way, where it's like I've always known about Coil mainly just due through like Current 93 and other bands
Mm.
associated with them. Like whether it's if I'm like looking up like interviews, I'll see like joint interviews where it's like um Coil, Current 93, Fetus, which I haven't listened to fully yet, and there was another band in that video. But during my earlier days of like discovering Current 93, like again, like I've said in plenty of the Current 93 videos that, I've been aware of like other groups like Throbbing Gristle, Cozy Fani Tutti, Chris and Cozy, and like seeing these names pop up, but never fully knowing who they were just because like I was just so stuck on Current 93. And now that enough time has passed, I feel like in order for me to like if I wanted to understand Current 93 better, just like what this culture was doing, like I need to just branch out. I just had to get through like those earlier stages, and like Coil was something that was a band that I always kept seeing a lot
Mm.
and was like, all right, like I know this is the next step to get into because like it took me a while to figure out like, oh, okay, so Sleazy was actually originally founding members of Throbbing Gristle. And
Yeah.
then when that broke up, they did stuff with Psychic TV, and then that's how he met John Balance because he will always come to like Psychic TV shows and stuff like that. And they kind of essentially also were a part of it. Like again, a lot of these artists, like I've always known were highly connected with each other. And in reality, I probably have been listening to Coil just on other people's projects. So like whether they had some type of participation or collaboration in the track in some way, shape, or form. So it's nice to like kind of be listening to Coil now. And after listening to like technically these three albums, I also did listen to the one EP and then that compilation album
Yeah.
that they did, which is
It's it's been good to go back and listen to a specific period actually, because I kind of my Coil listening was quite potted, you know. I'd listened to obviously the early periods, which I think most people would probably agree are the really essential. Um, Everything they produced with some bizarre records, and then the first Threshold House release, Love Secret Domain, 1991, I
yeah,
think.
yep, yep.
That really is the key to it all. But then, I'd heard a lot of the later stuff, songs to play in the dark and, uh, all of that stuff as well. And so it's been good to go back and really focus on that early period because, Horse Rotivator aside, which always seems to find its way into my rotation, uh, my rotivation, I guess you could say. Uh,
Motivation.
someone's gonna kill me for that in the comments. Um, but my thing is, I really, I still collect physical media. I was a CD kid, so I have many thousands of CDs just out of shot here. And I'm very much one of those when particularly if I'm driving to work, I have an hour drive to work. I kind of grab a stack of albums and go, and Horse Rotivator seems to always find its way in there, even though I've got other Coil records up there. So, um, yeah, it's been really good to kind of go through it and look at that period as a whole. And I was the same as you in the fact that I came to Coil by way of association with other projects. And for me, it was Throbbing Gristle because Throbbing Gristle, I've said in our first Current 93 video that we did together. That I came to Current 93 at university through a friend of mine. Robin Gristle, I actually knew before that, simply by virtue of the fact that I heard the name, thought that sounds, I have to know what that sounds like, you know? And then um, the great meme they did of the kind of classic, the Shangri-La style album cover for the Jazz Greats
Oh
album.
yeah, yeah. I have not
That was
listened to that yet. I still
that
need to.
is such a great. I just thought that was a great gag, and I thought, any artist doing that, I thought, no, I've got to. This has got to be worth listening to, and um, it's again, like we said with Current 93, it's not easy listening, but it's incredibly rewarding when you stick to it. And yeah, I think much
Yeah.
could be the same for Coil. Although I would argue, and maybe this is just my twisted sense of imagination, I didn't find Coil as repellent as I did with Throbbing Gristle or Current 93 right away. I got into Scatology and Horse Rotivator. They kind of just worked their way in a lot more easily than I expected them to. I don't know how you felt when you first heard them.
Yeah, I think again because when you get into when your first thing is Dog's Blood Rising, like anything after that is gonna be
Yeah,
easy listening because like it's like you hijacked your brain immediately to like be like, all right, this is industrial experimental at its like finest, at least in my personal opinion. Of course, there's probably better examples people might say, but still like Dog's Blood Rising still scares me. So like hearing something like this, and also I have been thinking, knowing that like because I know you're not as big into death grips as I am, but I would say this is like the first band where like I can actually say it kind of reminds me of Death Grips, or at least certain pockets of Death Grips sounds. Like so like their so Death Grip's last album that they came out with in like 2018 called Year of the Snitch, like when I heard the beginning of Scatology and also Horse Rotivator, it reminded me of that specific Death Grips album where I'm like, I don't know what the fuck to call this. It's like some weird freaky carnival type of sound or essence. It's just
it's
weird.
it's
It's the
really
only
interesting.
album that I know Death Grips probably been inspired by because like it's the for years I did not know what to like how to describe that album. And I would say if like if you wanted to get into Death Grips, you should either check out Government Plates or You're the Snitch. Because like that's kind of where I'm getting when it comes to listening to like these first three Coil albums.
It's interesting. I haven't actually heard Year of the Snitch, so I'll check that out. In fact, I'll probably do what I usually do and just buy a copy whether I like it or not. But um I that's really interesting that you say that. And I think it's funny you um brought up quite prudently brought up the connections with Psychic TV and kind of um where John Balance came from, um, which was, Psychic TV and obviously the connection with Robin Gristle through Genesis, Peorage, and so on. All three of those groups, Coil, um, Gristle, and Psychic TV, all have completely different sounds, but in a way dealt with similar themes, sexuality, death, religion, the occult, all fall under the umbrella of industrial music, but all sound completely different from each other. Um, and I think
Yeah,
that's a really interesting thing that I think about. And actually, I was thinking about this again earlier on. Those first three albums, first few releases, sorry, released on Some Bizarre Records, and I then looked up who was on Some Bizarre Records with Coil, um, because I've got a few bits for show and tell today as well, because I've just finished
nice,
a
nice.
couple of books that mention things adjacent to Coil. They're not Coil themselves. Um, you know, Einsturz and the Neubauten were on Some Bizarre Records, but then you have Mark Armand and Soft Cell, and perhaps more significantly, the work that he did with Mark and the Mambas. And if you haven't heard Mark and the Mambas, I really recommend checking that out.
Market, marking the Mambas.
Yeah, I really, really recommend that because um, don't get me wrong, I really like Soft Cell, and I think they found a way of taking synth pop and twisting it and making it interesting, subversive. Mark Arman was dealing with a lot of demons in the Soft Cell records, but Mark and the Mambas, he began to bring in influences from cabaret and jazz and things like that,
Hmm.
but still within a kind of an 80s post-punk context. Um,
I like the
and that,
artwork style of this. This is
yeah,
nice.
absolutely. And I think well, it's really funny because I've been listening to Mark and the Mambas for years, and it was only the other day I had that album on, and then I played Coil immediately afterwards, and I thought, you know what, there is a kinship there because, like you said, what would you describe? How would you describe Coil? It's like collage,
Yeah.
you know. And you could say that for a lot of these artists, particularly Throbbing Gristle, but they were kind of coming from more of an electronic place in a lot of ways, you know. Even though they might use some traditional instruments, they were finding ways of manipulating them. Cozy was really good at that. She played guitar on a lot of those recordings, but you would never know it was a guitar. Um, Chris Carter, who really was the kind of the brain of Throbbing Gristle, you know, he worked for the BBC, so he really knew about electronics and how to manipulate uh, the you know, under the hood, as it were. He really knew how to manipulate that and create interesting sounds. Even though most people think of Throbbing Gristle and they think of Genesis, um, but whereas on the other side, you could look at, you know, Mark and the Mambas and Soft Cell and say, well, there's more pop influence there. And then you've got elsewhere on the label, you had Swans a little bit later on doing that
Ooh,
no
nice.
doing the no wave noise, all guitar based, but taking it, you know, to an almost logical end point.
Yeah, I
And
think
then
Swans actually is another big I keep forgetting about Swans because I only have listened to like one or two albums, but
yeah,
they also really got me into like industrial pretty hardcore or like
yeah.
whatever you would call their sound. I just remember being like, I like this. This is
And
like a good in between.
this is it. And then you end up somewhere in the midst of all that is Coil that just draw upon all of it. Um, and it's an interesting thing to go back and listen to this. Because I full disclosure here, so just before we started recording, Trey and I were talking, and we were both talking about how much we like the post-punk period, and it's really my happy place when it comes to music that I like to listen to. My other happy place is about 7 or 8 years before that with the English progressive rock explosion. Bands like Yes, Peter Gabriel era Genesis, King Crimson, uh, bands like that. My favorite of which is a band called Van der Graaf Generator, who were the only band from that time who didn't have a guitarist. They had an organist, they had a drummer, a bass player for a while who left, a guy who played two saxophones at the same time, um, and a singer who also played piano. Um, and by the way, if anybody watching this hasn't listened to any of Van der Graaf Generator or Peter Hamill's solo material, there's a big argument, I would say, for him and them being a blueprint for a lot of this stuff. And it's a hill I'm prepared to die on because um, they were probably the only band not to be crucified by the punk generation. They were actually quite embraced because they're much darker and much harsher. And there are elements in their records, particularly, I really, I hadn't listened to them for a while, so I've got a long journey coming up. So I've got a stack from my collection here. This is half of the Van de Graaff albums. Um, but let me just look through here. I would say stuff like this, Still Life, and H to He Who Am the Only One, whatever that means. I would suggest there's a strong argument there that those albums had quite an impact on people like John Balance, whether they would admit to that or not, because there's a definite lineage in there. The collage effect of the music, the use of found sound and music concrete to kind of uh, express a particular um, story within the music. It all was done with the same intent or to the same end, I believe. But yeah.
Yeah, I have a lot of work to do. I need to get get into like these other different branches of influences because like honestly, I feel like when it comes to starting off with Current 93, getting into Coil, other artists, like I just want to keep branching out and like, create like a nice foundation of like, all right, these bands are starting this. What other people did they associate with at any particular amount of time? Just so I can
Yeah,
like, you know, kind of like I wouldn't say rush through, but just kind of have a good scheme of like some different influences that I have not been exposed to yet.
I
Because I can
think
definitely tell you, based off listening to Coil, I feel like I've just from like these three particular projects alone, like I learned so much and like I still got a ways to go. But I feel like there's more of a focused mindset about it now instead of how I was going about it with Current 93, where it's just like, all right, I already have a good, strong narrative. I know a lot of people have asked me if I even listen to Coil based on them knowing what type of music I'm into. I'm like, yeah, it's time to expand because, like, we only have so much time,
oh
like,
no, of
as a
course.
person. And I'm like, I always said I need to listen to as much music as possible. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to find a system of like getting through all of them.
I think
Oh,
it'd
what
be
were we gonna say?
interested to see if anyone in the comments has a thought on this too. But another um I don't know whether you would call it a scene, but group of artists who I feel might have influenced some of these bands' work is the krautrock scene out of Germany in the early to mid 70s. Bands I mean, Tangerine Dream are associated with that, but I wouldn't really put them in there. But bands like Arm and Duel 1 and 2, it's very confusing. Um, and Can, especially, Can were quite an early um, progenitor of, you know, taking electronics and trying to do something quite warped with it. And I mean stuff like this because I was listening to it earlier on. Um, Foulest Day by Armandul 2. This and the first album Yeti, well worth checking out. I will say with this to a lesser extent than Van der Graaf, I do wonder if this was an influence to some degree, but not totally. There is a lot of um, acid rock hippie jamming on here. Um, but within that,
Like Grateful Dead type of stuff.
yeah, less wig out than that. You know, a
Yeah.
little bit more spacey. The darker side of psychedelia, I would say.
Okay. Yeah, it
But
sounds like
within
something
that,
I'd be into.
yeah, but within that, there are, you know, if you kind of push past the bluesy solos and all of that kind of stuff, not that there's anything wrong with that. I love blues too. Um, but if you push past all of that, there's some really interesting things going on with tape manipulation, with what I would guess would be kind of custom made synthesizers, keyboards, that sort of thing, or manipulated keyboards. Um, and again, bits with recorded sound where they've clearly gone out. That sounds interesting. Let's record that, and then taken it to the studio and done something with it. So, yeah, I'd be interested to get anyone's opinion on that. Again, feel free to crucify me for this, but I'd be interested if they were an influence on any of these bands, because you can hear a lineage there, either accidentally or not, I think.
Okay. So you
But
wanna
where are we starting? Where are we starting? How to Destroy Angels?
yes, How to Destroy Angels. We can just talk briefly about this because obviously it's just like a little like the first one of the first things that John Balance had ever came out with, and it's literally just it's just sound. Like I remember the second song. I gotta bring it up real quick.
I do wonder how much more of an influence. Obviously, we we should say that Coil really is John Balance and Peter Christopherson.
Yeah,
A bit like Current 93, they've had a revolving cast of guest musicians throughout the catalogue. Whereas with Current 93, I always kind of see it that David sits at the top, and then you have one or two people who are always there, but they're not in charge.
yeah,
Um, Stephen Stapleton being the obvious example. I feel like John Balance and Peter Christopherson, it's very much the two of them together.
yeah,
However, ironically enough, I do wonder if How to Destroy Angels was more of a Peter Christopherson effort because it reminds me so much of the real chaotic side of Robin Gristle. Um,
yeah. Because like I remember like listening to Absolute Elsewhere, and it just felt like I was listening to binaural beats, and my ears just started ringing after the ending of it. Because I think the first version of it was like that remix version that Steven Stapleton had a participation in, or what.
yeah,
However, I know it's always different based on like what release it is. Because like I was thinking like is this the actual one? Because I know they always make different versions of stuff, and apparently it wasn't the official first How to Destroy Angels, but
mm,
still interesting intro to like getting into Coil because like I would say that's the first thing I've listened to intensely. I think it came out later, like around like the past 10 years, like like I don't know, because they're still releasing Coil stuff to this day.
yeah, yeah. I mean, um, John, you know, late of this earth, but there's still music that they're uncovering that he made, which is incredible, really. And
Oh yeah,
like
and
all,
sadly, I just realized Peter is also dead too. I didn't know he died like back in 2010. I was like, wait, what?
yeah, yeah.
Like I was thinking he was still alive this whole entire time. I was like, oh shit, oh they're
I
both
think I
gone.
did. Yeah, I think I did actually. But it's interesting how all of these artists are so prolific. Um, and again, like we've discussed before, um, they were working with emerging technology. None of these sounds existed. It's not like pulling it out of a sound bank into your DAW. You had to make this stuff yourself. And
Yeah,
and in that regard, How to Destroy Angels, there's a kinship there with those early Current 93 records because they do again have that kind of meditative, uh it's experience led music, you know, and it is meant to kind of be something. It's very drony, and I mean that in a good way. There's a kind of bizarre amalgamation of sounds in here, that I think if you're in the right mood and listen to it in the right way, can really transcend a kind of mundane listening experience. Um, you know, what's the subtitle on this? I wrote this down. Ritual music for the accumulation of male sexual energy. Which
I
I
like
think,
that.
yeah, and I think kind of sums up the. I'm gonna make another joke. Sums up the thrust of Coil's whole.
That's a that's, that's a good description of the anal staircase.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna make the joke later, but I'm glad I've made it now. Actually,
Yeah, like the expressions of sexuality on here are pretty blatant. Like it's
yeah,
easy to tell like when there's a moment being recorded of like people fucking.
Oh,
Like it's
absolutely.
like
And I
I think
think,
that was the one thing that like stood out to me the first time when I listened to like the remix version of Destroy Angels. And I was like, in a lot of it, I was like, yeah, this really sounds like it's coming out of the cone transmission throbbing gristle era. Because like I
yeah,
can definitely tell like John was really affected by Genesis when it came to a lot of that. Because like when I
definitely.
listened to a lot of those early interviews and cone transmissions, I feel like this is just the earlier version of Coil is just like an extension of that. Same way
Yeah,
you will hear that kind of throughout like their music, whether it's like you can tell this was like probably coming off of like the psychic TV era because
yeah, absolutely.
like
Um,
I can hear those sounds.
and uh, there's a quote in here. This is the third time this book has been shown on in these videos now. England's Hidden Reverse. Um, there's a section in here it's in the Coil section of the book. I can't remember exactly where. I should have bookmarked it. Fabulous book. If anybody hasn't read it yet, you can still buy this online. But there's a part in there where I think it is John actually talks about the fact that they were both. He uses the word saturated with influence from where they come from on those early releases. And you can really feel that on How to Destroy Angels, you know. But then at the same time, I think there might have been a bit of looking sideways as well to maybe what David was doing with Current 93, because the title track on here, there's like a there's a sort of almost Buddhist ceremonial feel to that. But then you've got this kind of percussion, this clanking metal percussion. There's gongs going on there. There's little metallic devices that have probably homemade that have this. Some of them just have this brilliant resonance, and on a decent pair of headphones, it can really take you somewhere. But yeah, I think I like you've just said, and like in the book here. Um, I think they were still finding their way
Yeah.
forward at this point.
Yeah, because like I would definitely say they didn't officially probably found their sound just based on like the first few listens where it's like it's solidifying even more. But like once you get to Love Secret's Domain, I'm like, all right, I think I get what their sound is.
Yeah, I mean, scatology. Um,
We can get into that too. Like
yeah.
I actually have a thesis for it, but I'll let you
Well,
see what you gotta say.
I was just gonna say, scatology is the first, the first official album, if you like. Um, 1985 on that one. Um,
Yeah.
they're still on some bizarre records. The same time they were working on soundtracks, they actually had a soundtrack rejected for the first Hellraiser film around this time, I believe. I think it was after Scatology came out, but that was going on as well. And I think Scatology really revealed John and Peter as uh, quite a filthy pair. Um,
Yeah.
it's
Yes.
right from the beginning with Ubu Noir, uh, which I love, and I had it on earlier this morning actually because I just really wanted to listen to the record before we did this. Um, there, right from the beginning, there's this sense of peeking behind the velvet curtain, like you've got an eye onto a world that you shouldn't be seeing.
Yeah.
Um, and I love that, and that sustains throughout the record, getting increasingly there's this increasingly sort of thick atmosphere of kind of uneasy depravity that I love it. I absolutely love it. But then there's something really free and exploratory about it, you know, um, for people exploring uh, notions of sexuality, the occult, and all of these topics that really, even then, were still very, very taboo. And we've said this before with David Tibet. Uh, there's a sense of freedom in these recordings, claustrophobic and impenetrable as they can often be to listen to. There is a
Yeah.
sense of freedom in there. But then there's confusion too, because Panic kicks in and it's a great pop song that's dismembered by, a sort of more, I guess, subversive collective psyche of the group. Um, Jim
It's
Thirlwell is on there under the name Clint Ruin, which I love. And actually, I didn't realize it was Clint Ruin. It was Jim Thirlwell, sorry, until I read this fantastic book, Season of the Witch, by
mm,
Kathy Unsworth. One of three fantastic books about post-punk and goth that have come out this year. Um, of the three, there's John Robb's Art of Darkness, and there's Lol Tolhurst from The Cure put a book out called just Goth. Of the three, I would say this is probably my favorite. I'm going to do a review of the three of them on my channel soon.
nice.
Um, but so until reading that, there's a good section on Jim Thirlwell in there. I didn't realize that he was Clint Ruin, right? And it all makes perfect sense because if you listen to Fetus, you can really, really see his influence because Panic sounds like it could be on um, Hole or Nail, two of the when he went under the unbelievably fantastic name of Scraping Fetus Off the Wheel. Um, you know, that could have been on either of those albums. And there's also a slight influence there from what Mark Arman was doing with the Mambas. That song, I think, of anything on this record, has the some bizarre sound about it. But then, it kind of goes off in a different direction, and you've got um, sampling and you know something like at the heart of it all, you've got these wailing horns and um, the piano stabs and all of that kind of stuff. It's all these emotions just crashing in at you. Um, yeah, fantastic stuff.
Nice. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just like trying to imagine all these like people because I just recently just discovered a Fetus not that long ago, or just realized like,
Yeah,
oh, okay, this is all seems like it's also a big influence because like they wouldn't be on like the same interview collage together. So I'm like, I
uh,
definitely want to explore more into that. And they also have so many different names where I'm like,
yeah,
you got Fetus on your breath, or just straight up
yeah.
Fetus. I'm like, this is interesting. Like they
You know,
even on the
I
Spotify, there's separate accounts
I
for all the
love
names.
I love the Nail and Hole records, and there's a T-shirt of the because I love the Nail artwork, and I was like, I don't know if I would go so far as to have Scraping Features Off the Wheel on a T-shirt, but I love the artwork, so I'm like really conflicted. But I also want to throw a mention out to the Tenderness of Wolves on here because it's an early example of Fairlight CMI sampling, which I think was an early, if not the earliest sampler, um, which I always wondered the kind of the origin of the Fairlight CMI, and it actually was invented in the suburb of Fairlight in Sydney, which is in Australia, which is pretty cool. Um, but I want to give a special mention to this because Gavin Friday is on it, from a band called Virgin Prunes, who are one of, I would say, I mean that we could do an entire series on the Virgin Prunes as well, and their links to U2 and their
Mm.
railing against Irish Catholicism because they were from Dublin, which nowadays is a very progressive city. At the time, it wasn't in the early 70s. Sorry, in the late 70s. But it's interesting that he's on here because they I kind of not being there myself and kind of seeing any of this stuff at the time, I always assumed that a band like the Virgin Prunes, because they were based in Ireland, were very much on the outside of everything. So it's interesting that he's kind of in here collaborating. And then you've got, again, brass. There's a lot of brass on this record.
For oh yeah, oh, scatology. Yeah, because I'm it's cool if I do my thesis real
Go.
quick on
No,
it.
you go, man.
Yeah, because like obviously like you have all the knowledge and I'm just like trying to like, all right, connect this band. But it's just like I really need to dig deep into like just the communities that were like associated because like I find them all interesting. I'll probably start listening to Fetus next after we do this video because like they seem very interesting. I don't know
Yeah,
how I would describe it, but it's just like that
Jim
raspy voice that he does along with like just all the chaotic like noises. I'm
Jim
like,
Thirlwell is a really interesting one because he worked with Nick Cave, and
ooh, nice.
you can definitely hear a kinship with Nick Cave in there. But you always get the sense with Jim Thirlwell that he's a fantastic pop writer, but he doesn't know how to write straight pop records because he's got all of this other stuff going on. And I find like when I listen to Fetus, it's the first thing I always think was is that if you took all this stuff out, you'd just be left with a absolutely banging 80s pop song, you know?
Pretty much. You even had the aesthetic and look for it too at the
Yeah,
time. That's like what
yeah.
kind of like threw me off when I was looking at those interviews. It's like I was like Coil, they're kind of middle ground. Of course, Current 93 seems like he's a hermit. That other band, seemed like just kind of outside our culture type of stuff. And then I look at what's his name?
Jim Thirlwell.
Jim Thurwell. I was like, why does he look like he should be like on the Breakfast Club or something like that. I'm just like, or just it just has that yeah that 80s aesthetic. I was just like,
There's a
that's very
fantastic
confusing.
there's a
But like,
fantastic live performance he did on a program called The Tube in the UK. Some very kind soul has actually collected every Tube performance and made a playlist. And I mean, this was a live music program actually presented by Jules Holland, who still presents live music programs here in the UK. But it only ran for about 5 years, but he had a lot of underground artists on there, and Fetus appeared on the Tube. Go and watch that live set because it is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant, and you do think, how can this guy be doing all of this? You know. But yeah, excellent stuff. Sorry, man. I'm
no, no,
talking too much here.
you're perfect. Like this is how I wanted it to be because like I don't know sh like you have more knowledge about Coil, all these other bands, and like I'm still like a beginner. I feel like when it comes to this stuff, so like I want to get as much information as possible. But scatology. So
Yeah,
obviously the first thing that like I noticed like when I had researched like I was researching like their discography, it was like, all right, so upside down cross with an ass and
yeah.
embedded in it. So I'm like, all right, I see where these guys are, at. All right, like this is what I'm about to get into. So I pretty much I say, okay. Branching off of cone transmission and throbbing gristle, quirky sample usage that feels like they are from a carnival or circus. Some parts of the album dabble in techno electronic music, which was a brand for certain elements of psychic TV and other things Genesis Peorage had hand in. With Sleazy being a part of those musical outfits, it would make sense. The song Panic sounds like it is derived from the same energy as the song of Power off the first Psychic TV album, Force the Hand of Chance. At the heart of it all takes a different music approach, setting a weary tone that sounds like it would be in an old Western soundtrack. That mood would transition into Tenderness of Wolves, going into a more occultic industrial aesthetic, very reminiscent of early Current 93 music, but with a more sinister undertone than David Tibet. The spoiler goes back to a chaotic circus vibe that is congruent with the first song. Clap seems to go in that same direction, just being a hypnotic loop of sounds that seem to serve as an interlude. Restless Day takes a somewhat traditional song route more in the vein of an experimental campfire song with a catchy melody sung throughout the lyrics. Aqua Regis displays a sound collage, creating a perfect representation of straightforward experimental music. Solar Lodge is my favorite like
Yeah.
song from them. Spam. Um, which is my favorite song on the album, is a monumental anthem with a really powerful chant. The song structure is traditional, but the industrial instrumentations operate as what you would hear in a rock band. Perfect combination of sounds that structures the chaos. The SWBP is just some expression of drones and noise, more interlude type. Godhead equals Death Head. In and let's misspell something. Begging of what sounds like two men having in the beginning is what sounds like two men having sex. Then this intense chant that feels like a representation of a riot. It gives me the same energy of Solar Lodge, just more dramatic in a good way. Cathedral in Flames has some hard-punching drum beats, very martial industrial. Tainted Love is a cover from the band Soft Cell. Coil gives the song a more grim expression to the song, with the actual song being more upbeat. It's a great closer to the album in nature. Knowing that David Tibet, Stephen Stapleton, Boyd Rice, and other collaborators that I have listened to in the past all worked on this album in one way, shape, or form, I hear a blend of familiar production work that I have grown to love. So it's interesting hearing their work through the realm of Coil, as I also unknowingly have been listening to Coil through these other artists. That's
I
my
mean,
thesis. After like the third listen, I think I wrote that like about a month ago.
that's brilliant, man.
I've given it more listens, but like after the third listen, once I got, because I was like, I really need to ingrain this in my brain because there's so much going on, and like,
Yeah,
while I love that type of stuff, it does take some time to like fully digest, because I'm like, all right, one type of vibe, different type of vibe. It's just like it is everywhere.
it
It is
is. And
everywhere, and also reading the lore of like John Balance and Sleazy. It's just like I'm just trying to like pick up, like kind of like catch up to speed, because like
there
there's a lot of history here.
there are a few things. I mean, that's first of all, that's really fantastic to listen to. And I agree with everything that you've said there, because there are
Appreciate it.
three tunes that you mentioned that I don't think I did, that I want to just pick up on before we move on. Cathedral in Flames, I love the beat. Like you said, martial is the perfect word, because it just um comes in just stomping straight away, and it really, the thing that strikes me about listening to this is, you mentioned how you kind of realized you were listening to these artists without necessarily listening to them, because they did collaborate a lot and play on each other's records, and kind of, you know,
Yeah, because
this
there were
guy over
parts where
here.
I'm like, sorry, there were parts where I'm like, am I listening to like David? Like I know it's John Balance, but like sometimes, like especially when they were probably younger, they all had like a
Yeah.
similar vibe where I'm like, this feels like a current 93 song, or at least an early version of it, but
Well,
like I'm feeling that same energy. But it's
the
just like on
interesting
pockets of like the albums.
the interesting thing is, because it's like this guy over here and played on this guy over here's record and vice versa. And it was almost as if, it's just come to me now, this actually. It's almost as if they were testing the water, of particular sounds with each other, that they would then take and apply to their own projects later, because there's stuff on here that sounds like stuff that Current 93 would eventually take and run with, um, on albums like, you mentioned Restless Day before. Um, a fantastic melody, and it is a campfire song, effectively. Um, it sounds like it could have come from not necessarily Swastikas to Noddy, but there's a line.
Yeah, it's certain correlations of like
Yeah. And
what.
I think all of these artists, because they knew each other well, clearly had good working relationships and personal relationships too. There was obviously something they recognized in each other that allowed them to keep doing this and keep working together. Um, and the other two things I thought, first of all, you mentioned Tenderness of Wolves, and the kind of the theatre aspect of that, which I would say definitely came from Gavin Friday because the Virgin Prunes were they started off as a visual art project effectively, and actually a lot of their gigs were almost like performance art. You know, Gavin Friday and Googie, the other singer. There were two singers in the band, um, three actually at one point. Um, would dress up, wear costumes, have props, and kind of put on these little transgressive art pieces with the backdrop of this music. And while the two sort of the two major records in Virgin Prune's discography, If I Die, I Die, which is essential listening as far as I'm concerned, and The Moon Looked Down and Laughed, still a fantastic record, but very different to that one, are very song based, although they would kind of take them apart when they played them live. The EPs that they put out, um, uh, Thing of Beauty and uh, Heresy, especially, which was put out on a French label. Um, First half of it was a live concert recording. The second half was an experiment in what it sounds like to go mad. So they stayed up for days on end with that and basically made a record without instruments, high on their own fatigue. Um, and I mean, that's what that's a more extreme version of tenderness of wolves, really. Um, and then the last thing I wanted to say before we move on, just picking up on something you said, you encapsulated it perfectly when you talked about the like this feeling of an old western. That's exactly what I thought the first time I heard Ubu Noir. It was like starting the reel to reel up, and I'm confronted with this sepia kind of faded glamour of like an old bordello or something like that, you know. Um, like I say, peeking behind the curtain and kind of seeing this illicit world that I shouldn't be being exposed to, but in
Yeah,
this really kind of far off. Um, yeah, I think there's um a sense of faded glamour. I think actually really unites a lot of the Some Bizarre artists, because I think Mark Armand is like that as well. Um, you know, this kind of slight, there are these slight Broadway and cabaret um, influences that creep into the music in spots, but in this really seedy way.
yeah.
And I think, yeah, I think that unites a lot of the artists on this label, that they have this kind of, you know, rather than walking down Broadway in New York, let's go down this side street and see what's down this alleyway, you know.
But yeah, like a grim aftermath of like wanting to live like the a luxurious lifestyle and realizing where it's actually leading you to, but you still kind of want to show it off, even though like you're going through a lot of shit inside. That's kind of like
Yeah,
what this get like it feels like. And there's so many other examples of like artists and bands who I love that are also playing off of the same concept. And it feels very authentic too, because I think we all have this idea of like what we probably should be like in the world, and we realize like, oh shit, we're too weird for this, but we still want that type of like glamour, but we're also jaded at the same time.
I
Like,
agree. I agree. And actually, it it segues really neatly into talking about horse rotivator because I think that
I didn't make a
almost
thesis for this one. I can. I just kind of forgot.
No, but
Yes, it's
I
been
think
rough.
it taking horse motivator almost feels like where a scatology kind of peek behind the curtain at these ideas. Horse motivator minces them up and spits them out again. It is such a destructive album, and these big fire blasted vocals. I mean, it starts off with a song called "The Anal Staircase," so you know what you're in for. Um, and yet at the same
It's
time, there are moments of kind of strange beauty. I think Babilero probably sums up the record in terms of, you know, you get this deep sense of, again, there's that word again, unease, set against kind of chant, Moroccan chanting, um, kind of custom percussion and that kind of thing. Even that's like 50 seconds worth of music that, but I think it sums up this record so beautifully in terms of um it doesn't there are no compromises given. It's not easy to listen to. And yet at the same time, like I say, there are real elements of beauty. There are strings on Ostia, um,
oh,
which I
I
think
love Ostia.
it's such
Uh,
a standout. And going back to that thing of faded glamour, you could imagine that kind of over the credits of an old black and white film.
I want
You
to
know,
kind of talk about Ostia real quick because
no, you go for it.
because I didn't really make a lot of a thesis for this one, or nor did I do it for uh Love Secrets Domain, because I literally just spent the last 2 days actually really listening to that album. But again, it's just like these first three projects and other little side projects, like they all kind of just like mix in my head. And since
Yeah,
these albums are
yeah,
kind of mixed bags in themselves, like I feel like I'm just mainly just digesting like the first era of Coil than like actually trying to fully understand these particular
yeah,
albums. Like I see like the separation of like their progression, but like I'm still really fresh when it comes to this stuff. But the standouts off of like so like I said on Scatology, the standout for me was a Solar Lodge because like
yeah,
I just love chants and anthems like that. I don't,
yeah,
it just like I've been having it on repeat for the last few days. But Ostia, I would definitely say it's like on the whole of what I've listened to from Coil, my second favorite song from them. If anything, interchangeable between Solar Lodge and
yeah,
Ostia. But this, even before I knew this was like the fan favorite, like I could tell like this, yeah, this is like the Magnus opum of this album. And kind
yeah,
of one of like their best songs in general because it after I figured because I just realized like when I had listened to it, I was like, Ostia, the death of Pasolini. And then I was like, Pasolini, what is that sounds familiar. And then I researched it. I was like, oh, this is the dude who made the movie fucking Salo, 120 Days of Sodom.
yeah,
Side note, man, I remember the first time I tried watching that movie was like I was in high school. I was like
man.
maybe 17. I it took me years to finish that movie because despite I would say I'm a pretty desensitized person. I've seen a lot of like fucked up media. Just I like listening to this type of stuff and bands like this. So like I'm pretty like used to like depraved shit.
Yeah, yeah,
But 120 Days of Sodom was
man.
it's like one of the only movies that actually makes me queasy. And like I kind of just had to like I was like, all right, I need to finish this movie. I just like skipped to the part where like I always leave off on because I'm just like, I can't stomach this anymore. And yeah,
I
it
think
didn't it really wasn't any better. I'm like, yeah, like this movie
no,
is fucked.
I think
And then
that and Cannibal Holocaust, the
oh yeah,
original
oh
one.
my God.
Um,
Oh my God,
you
man.
know, the fact. I mean, if they came out now, they would be shocking. You know,
Yeah.
and you think when they came out, it's like I cannot imagine. I mean, um, one of my one of my favorite films was the first Alien film, and people would run out of the cinema at that. And it's a scary film, but not on that level. you know.
Yeah.
And I kind of
Like,
think it does show in a way how far we've come, actually, that people burned the model of the, I don't know, how many of you out there have seen the first Alien film? But if I say the space jockey, hopefully most people will know what that refers to. They had the model of the space jockey outside the Alien premiere, which a load of people set fire to because they were convinced that it was going to incarnate some evil, some sort of evil, you know. And it really shows how far we've come. But there are obviously still people who would do that, but not. It's not quite that bad anymore. But no, I getting back to the record, I think you've actually raised an interesting point because again, these records have that same level of um shock value
yeah.
even now. I mean, even Ostia, there's the part towards the end where John Balance is singing you can hear the bones humming. I think that's what he says. You can hear the
Yeah,
bones
you can hear
humming.
the bones humming.
And the brass section, and the sorry, not the brass section, the strings, um, started off so beautifully, and it's only when he starts doing that you then think back to what you just listened to, and there's been this increasingly queasy uh, feeling about the strings. It then really there's this whole kind of wobbly, um, almost drunken stumble to the strings towards the end of that song, and it really puts a knot in your stomach, you know.
Yeah.
And I love that it ends like that because it's probably the most beautiful song on the record. Um, but
Yeah,
it
it's
doesn't
so good.
it doesn't let you off lightly, and kind of going back to that idea of again the faded glamour thing. It's like this little kind of slither of beauty in this cesspit, you know. Um, there's a great, great, great. I think it's a soft cell record. Um, Let me look it up. I only think of soft cell because they were on the same label, but I just think it really sums up uh, the kind of the imagery that these records conjure. Um, Let me find it because it's going to really bug me. Um, nah, I can't find it. I was thinking it was The Art of Falling Apart, which was their second record. It's not. It might actually be uh, a Mark Arman solo record, but never mind. But yeah, basically, there's a shot of him um, looking fantastic down this sort of grim alleyway with bins and rubbish and all of that kind of stuff. And it again, it kind of goes back to that thing of the side alley behind the theater and um, you know, looking onto a world that you shouldn't know about. And I kind of feel like, again, this is a bit of a strange comparison. Um, a modern band who, for me, are doing a similar sort of thing. I've got them over here, so let me just grab it. A modern band who are doing something similar but within a completely different style of music is Imperial Triumphant, who are from New York. I've got these two records, I think, are the two to get. This one, Spirit of Ecstasy, is the latest one that came out a couple of years ago or last year, I think. No, 2 years ago. And this one, um, which I really think is their absolute kind of Alphaville, this is called. This is their kind of magnum opus, if you like. They
Nice.
are a black and death metal band who incorporate jazz into what they do.
Interesting.
Kenny G is on this record. Kenny G with his flute is on this record.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
but they look pretty pretty fucking cool, to be honest.
Some
Um,
eyes wide shut type of stuff.
what I love about them, first of all, is that when they're not in all the get up, they're just like completely normal guys who make this insane music. But I'm getting way off topic here, but there's a kinship with bands like these, I feel, because Coil, if Coil are looking behind the curtain and kind of showing you this uh world behind the world, you know, um, that there are these grains of um, sexual liberation, a fascination with the occult and death, because it's all in us. It's in all of us. Whether people on the mainstream would ever admit, it's all in there. You know, um, if they're looking at the world behind the world and what's behind the alley, this shines a light on the opposite side of that and how hollow the the main streets are, and how hollow the wealthy kind of glittering prize of society can be. And so it was only when I was listening to Horse Rotivator the other day that I thought, this really reminds me of Imperial Triumphant. In no way whatsoever, because musically they don't sound anything alike. But yeah, another thing that kind of came to me the other day when I was going back to these.
Yeah, for me, horse rotivator, like coming off of scatology, like I feel like I'm starting to have a better grasp of like what type of sounds that they're experimenting with and all the different genres they honestly incorporate
Yeah,
with them because like some correlations again like kind of how you're saying like certain bands like you make these correlations even though they don't sound exactly the same. The other band that I feel like I can relate to doing things in a certain attitude is probably like the Gorillas and how like
yeah,
there's a whole different collage of sets that Damon Albarn is like working with primarily just collaborating with so many different artists and putting sounds that you never just thought would go together. And it's just interesting. I'm just
mm,
like, it's progressing that. And like, there are a lot of like, because I hadn't really always listened to a lot of electronic music growing up. And so it's like, these albums have been helping me like, get into it more, especially knowing like there's a backstory to like what they're doing and like the history
absolutely,
behind it. And
absolutely,
so the more that like I listen to it, and because I'm about to continue listening to a lot more Coil because I really want to like understand this band. And
yeah,
since you told me that like a lot of like the newer generation's probably going to be lost on this band, it's like I'm like, yeah, this I want this band to like still be well known because like when it comes to
yeah,
experimental
definitely,
music, they seem to be like I'm not gonna say pioneers, but well, I mean to a degree, yeah, like Sleazy definitely is a pioneer of being part of like the first industrial band. So like,
yeah,
yeah, this is still in like the early stages of creating this like very abstract, not even just music, but just like uh at least within the past 100 years of like human expression, like actually bringing the mental to the physical and how they
yeah.
express themselves.
I
And I
mean,
feel like industrial and experimental is going to start getting more popular in
I
recent
really hope
times too.
so. And I mean, going back, thinking about sorry, that's my alarm going off. Where's that going off? Thinking about Horse Rotivator, that there are great pieces of music on here that I think most people who are discerning music listeners would get something out of, like Ostia. But then there's the stuff that's a lot more confronting to the point where it doesn't feel like, if we're kind of putting music in the box of being entertainment, it doesn't entertain you. Something like Blood
Just
from
the
the
complete
Air,
opposite.
for example, it feels like, if you listen to Blood from the Air, apart from the fact that the percussion feels like a migraine, it's so well mixed. in so far as the effect that they're trying to have on you, it is so perfectly mixed for that. The pulse and the metallic, you know. Um, there's a quote from the film Shutter Island, the Scorsese film Shutter Island.
Oh yeah.
Ben Kingsley, as the psychiatrist or psychologist, says that a migraine is like opening a box of razors, tipping them into your skull and shaking it as hard as you can. That's what the percussion on Blood from the Air sounds like. And the vocals are so evil and nasty. And, you know, there's found sound of people crying and whimpering, kind of in distress on here. Um, and then in comes this deadpan vocal. God is a sadist, and everyone knows it. And it's just, I mean, people write about the negative effect of religion all the time, all the time. And yet, in one fell swoop, you hear a piece of music like that, um, Blood from the Air, and you just think, well, that's it. That's the end of this fascination, surely, because nobody is ever gonna go beyond this. I mean, it's the heavy. I challenge any metal fan to listen to something like this and not go, yeah, it's pretty heavy, because it is. Um, and then on the kind of the flip side of that, you have something like Herald, which again shows their kind of twisted side because it sounds like a Salvation Army band. Um, Salvation Army, for anybody not aware who might be watching this, is a charity, a Christian charity um, that work with homeless people a lot. And they have, let's say, traditional views on certain types of people and certain sexual persuasions. I'll put it like that so that we don't get uh, blocked for this on YouTube. But
Yeah.
they don't like certain groups, right? And so to put that in Herald and make it sound like a demented marching band, again, it's like they're. Whereas I think Current 93 go through and David go through this, as you've said, purging of a religious uh, background or something, kind of a weight on a shoulder. In a
Yeah.
lot of ways, Coil do the same thing, but by eviscerating it and almost holding a mirror up to it and showing it for what it really is in a very, very, there's a juvenility to it. You know, it does feel like, you know, there's kind of this sort of youthful angst about it, but it really holds up with, you know, the more you listen to it. And I think that's why, you know, I really hope this stuff kind of grows in popularity again because it's not easy listening, but it is, I think it's important.
Oh yeah, because especially due to the fact like when I was looking at a bunch of Coil interviews, they really always brought upon how like when they're reflecting on the earlier music they were making, specifically like for songs for like the cover for Tainted Love,
Yeah.
against like the whole like AIDS epidemic and again when it came to the sexuality part of like what most of their music was representing, whether even though they weren't trying to be, and this is Peter, like Sleazy saying this, like we never consider ourselves like a gay band. Most people just put us in that label, and they still had stuff I think that represented, the struggles of what was going
Mm.
on for you know, people who were homosexual during that time period. And, they got a lot of pushback on like some of those songs. Like some stuff was like, banned to be played and stuff like that and
Yeah.
on certain radio stations. And that's literally word from mouth from like some of the interviews I saw of them. So it's like, I can tell there's a lot of like history when it comes to these albums and what they were representing for
Yeah, for
those
sure.
particular time periods. And it just gave me a lot of insight because like again it's like they go on so many different types of topics. But, I do think their sexuality is one that definitely stands out when it
Yeah,
comes to most of their music, and it gives me an interesting perspective, especially as someone who's like a straight male, like peering into like a world that I'm not fully aware of, or
yeah,
like I have never really known about or grew up with, and kind of understanding like the emotions and struggles that they were going through in that sense. And in being an art college kid too, it's like honestly, I was around all different types of people from walks of life and kind of already started getting that understanding of like,
mm,
you know, oh, we're all the same, but at the same time, like, but we kind of feel like we're outsiders because we have very particular, ways of living that most of normal society wouldn't agree with. Because
yeah,
like for me, growing up, like, I was always considered like, oh, like Trey's just like a weird black kid, doesn't like sports or do stuff like this. And I'm like, I feel like I don't fit anywhere and shit like
yeah.
that. So I'm like, well, like, where am I going to fit in? And so
Uh,
it's like, I understand that energy and
and
just
I
like,
think that's why, although um they're different musically, they're different in terms of the themes they discuss. But I think that's why a band like Coil fits nicely between Imperial Triumphant, a contemporary band, and a band like Van der Graaf Generator, late 60s, early 70s. They still exist too. But Coil fits right into these because they they tell stories in a very, very visceral way. You don't need to. I suppose what I mean is, insofar as you don't need to rely on um, reading the lyrics, although particularly in the case of Peter Hamill, incredible lyricist, but you don't need to do that because they're showing you. They're showing you through the music, and it's
yeah, it's funny you say that because like that's another thing I feel like, I think it's easier for me to like get into when it comes to this band because like obviously with like Current 93, I had to like read the lyrics to try to figure out like just an inkling of what they're talking about, where
yeah,
it's like most of it is very drony and ambient, and when there are lyrics, like they're pretty straightforward. So
yeah,
it's like I'm primarily just digesting like the sonic sounds and like what those sounds are expressing, like what emotions are they expressing. And honestly, and little quick mention of like their, I guess what you would consider their third album, but it's more of a compilation project. I think gold is the metal with the broadest shoulders. So I think
yes,
that from what I can remember, it was a compilation project of like something that they stuff from like a soundtrack that they did for I think the movie you were talking about, or some or
Hellraiser, yeah,
yeah, or like it didn't get in there, but like I could tell what pockets of the album were you know from different things that they were working on, because like it's not
yeah.
really cohesive, but there are
No,
pockets of it that are cohesive. And
I
I'll
think.
actually say I love the beginning part of like this project, because when
Oh
it
yeah,
comes to like Coil's like repetitive like clanky sounds that they do, it's just like dun, 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 dun. It's like very hypnotic, but in a very,
yeah,
I won't say aggressive, but just like intensely engaging way, where it's just like it's meditative, but you also just like kind of you want to either maybe dance or just like headbang to it in a
yeah,
little
yeah.
way. And I just like that a
I
lot.
feel that Horse Rotivator, if it had a if it had a purpose, it was to confront and scare you because, to end an album with, I mean, as well, the production on Horse Rotivator is leaves ahead of Scatology
Oh
and
yeah.
the first EP. Um, they also managed to get Peter Vaughan on it, who was a BBC narrator here in the UK in the 70s. How they managed that, I don't know. He did some narration on there, but to end with a piece of music like the first minutes after death, which is the
Oh yeah.
heaviest thing I think they maybe ever did. Um, that's not by accident. They want to wound you when you come out of that, and they do. You know, um, Whereas, like you said, gold is the metal. There is a little bit more of that influ- influence. I that's maybe not the right word because they were concurrent with each other, and obviously Jim Thirlwell worked with them. But there is a little bit more of that fetus element in there, where it's
Mhm.
like, okay, yeah, this is heavy, this is industrial, and quite, uh, you know, again confronting. But I want to get up and dance to this. You don't
Yeah.
get that on Horse Rotivator at all, and I completely get because there are some really negative reviews of Gold is the Metal out there. I do understand that because it's very scatterbrained, um, and you know, there's not the cohesion of
Yeah.
even scatology feels like the tracks on that feel to me like they could only belong on there. This doesn't feel like that, but I still like it. Um, you know, Paradisiac, I really like. You know, I love the really kind of filthy horn section on there. Um, you know, again, for there are explorations in other other cultures other cultures' rhythms on on these records in the same way that David was doing with Current 93 and um you know there's a definite kinship with that, but I think where David began to get away from the purging, literal purging of the early records quite quickly. um these feel like, what am I trying to say, there's too much of a fascination with this kind of filthy underbelly. Um, and because of that, even when they're writing um, straighter tunes, there's always this kind of creeping. Ugh, you know,
Yeah.
you can almost cut that atmosphere as you're listening. You know, and I think it actually comes from the brass section. I think the inclusion of brass, um, and those kind of like you say those western images and the use of this like twangy guitar in parts as well, um it all kind of conjures this um roaring, this kind of Ernest Hemingway faded, you know, faded kind of early 20th century America.
Yeah.
It conjures all of that with this kind of seedy underbelly, um transgressive uh art artistic approach. And I just think, like I said, with David began to work out his purging through, you know, the neo folk stuff, the acoustic stuff. Coil would get there too, but they never lost their, I don't know, their fascination with um, what goes on the peep
Curtains.
behind the peephole.
Yeah, and and coming off of that, we can probably end this off on
Yeah,
Love Secrets Domain.
yeah,
And I was saying, so it's funny when I had, because I had spent like the a good few months since we last had talked, and it was primarily just listening to scatology and horse rotivator for almost the past 3 months. And of
yeah,
course like dipping my toes in like the other side project stuff. But I recently just started listening to Love Secrets Domain because like I remember I was going on the treadmill to run, and I was like, okay, I thought I had the gist of what Coil was, and then I put Love Secrets Domain on, and I'm like, oh wait, I can't listen to this right now. I gotta be in a different headspace for this because like this is something completely different.
it's a party album, right?
Yeah, I was like, wait a minute, hold up. Like
It
this feels like a party. Definitely going, it's more upbeat,
it's a
much
party
more
album.
chaotic, but more put together.
Yeah,
So it's like, I would say it's like Love Secret's Domain. From like listening to it at least a good 3 times, I'm like, this is probably their most chaotic album, but you can't if you can feel it, but you can't really feel it because like I think they got the structure of how to
I
make a
agree.
proper album
I
this
agree.
time. And
This
like they're
feels.
finding themselves.
I agree. This feels like it's less apocalyptic, but no less chaotic. Like I say, it's just a party album, but only the weirdos are invited, right?
Exactly. And like
Um,
especially like with songs like uh Things
Disco
Happen.
Hospital, and
Yeah, just
yeah,
like
things happen.
just pretty much like the whole entirety of the album, but like
Yeah,
the standouts were obviously like the beginning, where it's just like, and I'm just like, okay, yeah, this is feel like I just took a hit of something,
but
and then
even then, like you said, the chaos is there because there's some great use of electronics and cutting tape
yeah,
on there. Oh gosh, Teenage Lightning. Um, there's some really cool, uh, warped vocals on there. But then there's a bossa nova beat that kind of drives that. Um, I mean, it's probably, and I use this phrase advisedly, it's probably their most accessible record, certainly
yeah,
to this point. Um, and even that title, Love Secret Domain, I think that is of all of their like album titles, that absolutely defines what they're about, I think. You know,
yeah,
because love makes you crazy. Um,
exactly.
I shouldn't say that with the door open and Fran in the next room. So if you're watching this, which you probably are, I love you. But love makes you crazy, and they they capture that so perfectly on here. Um, you know, but then again, there's this tremendous sense of dark humor. Um,
Yeah.
you know,
Listening to this reminds me of like watching Adult Swim as a child. It's just
yes,
like it's
yes,
like I know I'm not supposed to be watching this, but like it's just like literally a nice little secret domain.
yeah,
Like that's actually a really perfect representation. It's just like you're not supposed to be watching, but you can't, and like you're
yeah,
risking to get in trouble in order just to like be entertained by like this
absolutely.
very bizarre world of like crude humor. Some of it is like comprehensible, some of it is not, and like that's literally how early Adult Swim was to
I
me.
mean,
I
he
that just hit me.
they were so. I mean, a piece like "Things Happen," right?
Yeah,
And that
exactly. That's that's
kill the creator, send them a bomb. That is so mid 2000s, like meme culture. It
yeah.
like anticipating it by 25 years, 20 years, whatever it is.
Yeah, and I don't know, like
Brilliant.
every time, because like I knew this wasn't a song to be like taken overtly serious, but like it still is just bizarre. I don't know why it's like whenever you're like the woman who's like just kind of just doing some weird stream of thought monologue and
Well,
just saying, "How does it feel in Ohio?" I'm like, I was like,
this was it. Like,
Ohio.
so it's Annie Anxiety again, who obviously popped up on Current 93's early recordings too.
Yeah, I feel like
She
I
sa-
have heard her before. I was
she
like, why
sounds
does she
like
so
she's
familiar?
she sounds like she's down 2 bottles of whiskey before doing that track. Um, and the thing
Wait a minute. I know who. What was her name again?
Annie Anxiety. The thing I always forget about Annie Anxiety is that she is American. I always because she's on a lot of these English um records.
Yeah, I just realized. I think I remember hearing her on like either Dog's Blood Rise. No, maybe it was Nature Unveiled.
It's on
It's just
Nature
like,
Unveiled, yeah.
yeah, it's just she was doing like, here, don't
Yeah.
think I was
I
like,
mean,
what? Oh,
she's
okay.
worked with so many people, so many people like from uh dance pioneers like Paul Oakenfold to Lee Scratch Perry. She's worked with Living Color, I believe, as well. But she's probably best known, I think, for working with Crass, the
Mm.
anarcho punk band. She worked a lot with them. And in fact, if there's a punk band I'd recommend checking out, certainly from a lyrical point of view, Crass is a good place to go.
So,
But yeah, this record, like I say, it is probably their easiest one to get into.
yeah.
Um, and I think my favorite track on this is Dark River.
Same.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to talk about Dark River. Oh
what
my
a beautiful
goodness.
song. Um,
Like, hold up. Sorry. I'm accidentally. Sorry about that. Okay. What were you
no,
saying?
no, I was gonna say for all the love you and I and many of the people watching have for this incredibly abrasive music that to most people just sounds like noise and torture. Um, and but for all of that, you then get this quiet, almost eye of the hurricane moment in a piece like Dark River, which really
Yeah.
shows the genius of these people that they can come up with something just so beautiful like that. And
Yeah. Because it
um,
struck me right away. I was just,
yeah,
I mean,
and a bit like Ostia on Horse Rotivator, it's still, for want of a better term, weird. There's these really kind of odd electronic flourishes that kind of swish around. Um, you know, the way the guitars are blended and this kind of deep throbbing bass that runs throughout it. It's still a Coil piece, but just so so stunning, and it really it's perfectly placed where it comes on the album, and I think it's really needed as well because it's this fantastic moment of it's like coming up for air. Um,
yeah.
you've had your head underwater for a long time, you come up for air. It really is needed at that point because then it goes off into something completely different again.
Yeah. It's just like, and then goes into like the second part of Teenage Lightning. Hold up. Again, like, jog my memory. Is Teenage Lightning the one that has that vocoder, like,
Yes,
speech? Okay. Yeah. That was another, because again, I just recently, like, actually started diving into, like, this album. So, like, I'm not putting sound to like the name is still kind of hard for me, but like, yeah, Teenage Lightning Part One and Part Two. What I really like about that is like how the vocoder on like, what would you say the type of instrumentation is again?
bossa nova, I would say on
Yeah, yeah,
the
it's just
beat on
like
that.
hearing those sounds together in a way where it's like you think it wouldn't work, but like it does,
It
and actually
really
kind of
does.
makes you feel like you're entering into some like weird futuristic like uh space and time. Like kind of like as if I'm like listening to like a Black Moth Super Rainbow
Yeah,
album that like got, warped into a different dimension or something like that. And
yeah.
then we got the
It's
song Window Pane. Oh my, also another highlight of mine, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, so I did some window pane I wanted to talk about because it sticks out so much on, well, to be honest, not just on this record, of all the Coil albums I've listened to. And apparently they got quite a pasting about this at the time, and it was kind of seen as a bit of a sellout. But
Mm,
it's such it's a great track. It's a great song. Um, and I can see why it would upset some of their really kind of dedicated uh, industrial audiences that kind of came to these bands to get away. They might like music like that, but they come to these bands like Coil, Gristle, Current 93 to get away from all of that.
yeah.
Um, but it had a really dodgy video which you can get, which is on YouTube. Go and check that out because it's hilarious. It's so bad. But it's almost house music in a way, and it's aged really well. I want to say that of a song like this and from this period, it's aged really really well. It doesn't sound like a piece of throwaway 80s rubbish. It's a it's a great a great song. Um, and that line, "Gold is the sky and concentrate." I mean, it's worth it just to hear John yelling that.
Yeah. And honestly, at this point, like my memory of like any song after that, like I've listened to every single song. I just can't remember them fully. So if you want to like take a stab at like, explaining your feelings
Yeah,
on the
I
rest.
mean, um, further back and faster is after Window Pane, and they used Aboriginal percussion on an instrumentation on elsewhere on the record, but I think here you really get like there's a didgeridoo on it, but set against this kind of delayed, echoed drum machine, um, which is, you know, again, who thinks to do stuff like this? It's the meeting of two completely different musical worlds and times, really. And that's something actually we've not really talked about this much with Coil, but we had talked about it with Current 93.
Yeah.
This kind of collision of um, ancient and modern technologies. And I think it's something that these bands do really, really well because they are so uninhibited and have that. And again, I think this could have only happened in the wake of punk. Um, to kind of think, well, why can't we do this? Who says we can't? Um, and again, um, another really kind of angst-ridden track. It's 8 minutes long. I think it's the longest song on this by quite some way. Um, and then you're kind of brought home with Titan Arch, which is it's got Mark Armand on it. So the although this wasn't on Some Bizarre Records, they moved on by then. There was still that kinship there, and he sings on it really quite beautifully. Sounds like it could be on Horse Rotivator. This it's a really kind of brooding tune that by the time it ends, you feel like something is about to happen, and it's not going to be good. Um, but yeah, then you kind of get towards the end of the record. You get Lorca, not Orca. I think I haven't got it. Got the track list up.
I
Um,
got it's like Titans Arch Catastrophe, Lorca not Orca, and then Love Secrets Domain.
yeah, and so Lorca, not Orca kind of reprises the Teenage Lightning idea, and kind of then you get flamenco guitar, but linking back to the theme from Teenage Lightning. So there's all of this stuff going on, this big melting pot of influences. Um, and then, like you say, the record ends with the title track. Um, More bossa nova on this one, with John kind of snarling his way through it. But there's a real funk to that song, and it's quite an apt way to end it, and quite an apt way to end this cast, I think, because that track kind of sums up everything about where they'd been and where they were going, because you've got this collision of many, many, many different cultural reference points, all coalescing into this one track that sounds like um this it sounds like a demonic talking head song,
Hmm.
effectively, you know, which kind of there's that little grain of the time that they were around and absorbing influences from other forms of music. Then they're bringing in all of these things from other cultures alongside their industrial roots from where they came from initially. And I think, like I say, this is really, it's probably their easiest record to pick up and get into, but it's beguiling and bewildering at the same time. And I feel like that title track is a really nice way of, if I was going to give someone one Coil song and kind of say, yeah, this will give you the gist of it. I think it's probably that.
Yeah, and again, and to make another comparison to like a Death Grips, I would say this album also slightly reminds me of like what I would consider, of course, you probably definitely heard of like the Money Store, which is considered Death
Yeah,
Grip's most accessible album to this
yeah.
date because it came around like 2012 after they had just came out and they were like a very obscure industrial hip hop rock punk band that like no one knew about, especially during that time
No
period
one
of
sounds
the
like them.
internet. And like for them to come out with a record like that, it's like, whoa, this is completely different. It's like, yeah,
Yeah,
like you were saying, like want to dance to it. Like again, it's like when it comes to listening to Coil, I'm always relating back to like certain pockets of Death Grips that
yeah.
most people probably wouldn't associate with Death Grips because even fans at the time during like their journey as art as a band, like there's a Death Grip sound that everyone is always able to recognize. It's like the hardcore screaming and just chaoticness, but then
Yeah,
that chaoticness is also expressed in other ways that are more, conventional or just not in the same ethos of like what people know them for.
sure.
And yeah, like so it's just like the Money Store, um, Government Plates, and Year of the Snitch, I would say are those Death Grips albums where I feel like I can relate to, Coil to a degree and how they just approach, how to go about things.
Definitely.
And I highly would not be surprised if any one of the band members are probably most likely influenced by Coil because it's just like these are very specific sounds. And I wouldn't be surprised if they actually sampled Coil on Year of the Snitch because like there is a certain sound on
Mm,
like Scatology or Horse Rotivator that is definitely on Year of the Snitch. And I'm like, okay, they had to like sample that because like there's no other place I'm hearing this
yeah,
sound other than Coil.
yeah.
So
No,
it's like, yeah, love Secret's Domain. Like, again, like, cause like, it's funny because at first I was like, am I gonna like this album? Because it seems little bit too different than the other two albums. But again, I was trying to take a run listening to an album very fresh and doing it for an hour. I'm like, I don't think I can do this right now. And then took the time, got off of work, really sat down with it, and I'm like, okay, this is still Coil. They're just more solidified
yeah.
and they are really going into their own with this one.
This is the
And
one that I think if you like Fetus or you like even some of the more some of the darker post-punk bands like the Birthday Party or Sex Gang Children, this is the one for you, I think. I think this is the one that you'll get something out of.
a little funny, like a side note of the album cover. Apparently, like I guess they were at Stephen Stapleton's house and like went to like his shed and like this is like a painting on his shed. So that's where the
I
album cover comes from.
I can well believe that. If you've watched the Nurse with Wounds documentary on YouTube, I can well believe that.
Yeah. The brainwash one.
Yeah,
Yeah. I was like seeing his place. I'm like, yeah, yeah, he likes to live out in like the forest, like honestly, it looks really amazing. It looks really amazing.
it does. Yeah, it does. But
But
yeah,
it's
I
just
think
funny how like there's that correlation of like these dudes were all connected with each other in one way, shape, or form. It's like like no one would like if you're not in the know, no one would have known that that this album cover was from Stephen
no,
Stapleton's house. It's just
no,
like just little nuggets of like fun Easter eggs just to like figure out.
it
It's like,
is, and
oh,
I think that's why books like this are such a great resource because quite honestly, um, you would never you would never look at any of these bands and think to yourself, oh yeah, they come from a scene or you know there are other artists doing a similar thing because without any knowledge of them as people they seem to just come up from nowhere and obviously
yeah.
at the time it was really hard to get information on any of this stuff um but yeah I think to this is a good place to kind of end this, I think, because um, they they were speaking a language that I think wasn't easily digested, but needed to be said. And I think when people find, like I just said, it's not easy stuff to listen to, and it's not easy stuff to find. But I think for the people who do find it, the same people who find it will generally get something out of it. Because I think you have to want to look for it as much as you have to want to listen to it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
And because again, like I said, I feel like a lot of the subject matters that they're into, whether it's the occult, different forms of religion, the esoteric, a lot of it is like I feel like dealing with inner personal working of
yeah,
like your spirit and thinking beyond the realms of the human form. And
definitely.
most people in society would see that as like disruptive. So it is always going to have a chaotic nature.
Yeah,
And you kind of have to like sacrifice like your social well-being in order to, at least like with people around you, people who love you, or just society as a whole. It's like you really are forcing yourself to be an outsider. But with that, you're also gaining self-discovery, which I feel like is kind of a priceless thing,
it
knowing
is.
that like society forces you to be constructed to these forms. And it's mainly, I do think this stuff is more than just music. It's an expression of like the human psyche, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Like
it is.
like on a
And
Carl Jung type of level.
I
And
agree. And, you know, um, while I'm not a psychologist by any means, I think that, when you are seen as an outsider, in a way, it's not necessarily a good thing, as one, as an outsider all the way through my life so far. It's not necessarily a good thing because you're kind of
no.
seen as the weird kid and you're on the outside of everything. But then when, if you learn to, and this, like I said, um, I'd never want to tell anyone how to live. If you learn to channel that weirdness and those fringe um, interests you have, when you learn to channel those into something constructive like this, I think people who start out as the weird kid, not always, but generally, find things very fulfilling like this. Um, because I think there's a little sense of kind of exclusivity to music like this and forms of
Yeah.
art like this that weird people kind of love, even though we're not supposed to admit that, because
Yeah.
we kind of feel like we are in this little secret society. Um,
Exactly.
but I think it's the older I get, the more I realize that I'd rather have been the weird kid at school because I've instilled in myself a very distinct sense of who I am. And I think that's a really hard thing to achieve. And I feel very grateful that I have that personally. I haven't always, but it's music like this that I think can remind you of that and remind you that, you know, looking through the other side of the curtain is fascinating. Whether you choose to go through or not is another thing.
Exactly. And it comes in, I feel like dedicating yourself to that type of mindset and being able to find other people, no matter how long it takes. Like we did, just like from you seeing one of my videos and us making videos together. I think it all, it's slow process, but it
Yeah,
all kind of makes sense like later on like
definitely.
why did we get here? It's like, well, oh, it's
Definitely.
because like we want to connect with a very particular type of mindset. Not to say
Definitely.
that we're better, but it's just like it just feels more truer to us,
Absolutely.
especially because there's a lot of pain that came from like being ostracized or not ever fully fitting in because like we never really got, at least like to the same degree as like our peers, the same type of attention or affection as like other people did, because whether it's just like being included and stuff, or not really having that human connection the same way,
Yeah.
especially when you're a kid, and like it's just like I'm doing everything that they're doing. It's just, but like, why am I ostracized? Just because like I
Yeah,
like
and
this very specific mundane thing that really shouldn't be criticized.
I you
Not
know, I want to say as well that just before we finish here that if anyone is watching this who is younger than Trey and I, and you kind of you're relating to this music, and you feel like you're kind of on the fringes, that's okay, you know, because I think, like I said, when you kind of learn to harness that and appreciate um that just because you like this thing over here that nobody else understands doesn't invalidate it at all. And I think, you know, the fact that you can appreciate these things um, will generally mean that you have quite a free and open mind, and that can only be a good thing.
yeah.
Um, Also, the popular kids at school, the time they hit 18 and they leave those gates for the last time, that doesn't mean shit anymore. So,
Yeah. Just just wait. Have patience. Patience is
yeah,
a virtue. I
absolutely.
feel like there's a lot to be gained from listening to bands like Coil,
Yeah.
bands like Current 93, and other bands like who all fall in the same structure of categories, if
Yeah.
you can
And
call it that. You're gonna get something out of it much more than like your av like again, nothing against like mainstream songs, like because I
no,
still
no,
love listening to mainstream stuff. Like
absolutely.
it's like dude, I can definitely put on like some Taylor Swift every once in a while
Yeah,
and just be
no,
like, this is nice. Like
she's
I love the
she's
simplicity.
she's unbelievably gifted as a pop songwriter. Like no one can deny that. She is
Exactly.
a fantastic pop songwriter, and she's done it all almost single-handedly. She writes all her own music. Um, that's the big thing for me is that if they write their own music, I don't care what they do because it's an expression of who they are.
Exactly. And the fact that
Um,
she also is taking charge of like wanting more control over her music and like making her own versions of like uh albums she's already put out.
yeah,
I'm sorry. Like if there's anything that's punk, that's punk right there. Because the
absolutely,
music industry is
absolutely.
actually very upset that she's doing that, and they're
Yeah,
trying to make laws to make sure other artists don't do that. I'm
yeah,
like, no,
absolutely.
that's a power move right there. Like I
Yeah,
don't care if she's like the biggest like mainstream artist, like that is a power move that
yeah,
I have the
absolutely.
utmost respect for. So it's just like, again, I know it's random. We just started talking about Taylor Swift, but it's just like
No, but
I think a mentality of realizing that you really can
that
do anything with music in or your
that's the
artistic expression.
mentality. I think that's a great way to end because none of the bands we've talked about, uh, you know, Coil, Current 93 to an extent, I guess, but none of them sound the same. Talking about some of the other bands that I mentioned, Van der Graaf and Imperial Triumphant, these two bands sound nothing like each other, and they don't sound like Coil either. What links them is the intent and the mentality behind the music. And that I think that's what punk is. And I think that's what um, links up really disparate artists together. It's the intent behind it. And like you said with Taylor Swift, to do something like that when you're arguably the biggest artist in the world, I mean, obviously she can afford to do that.
Yeah.
Should it all go wrong for her, she's not going to be hurting. But you don't do that unless you really believe in what you're doing. And, you know, I think we all need to be reminded of that sometimes.
Yep. Totally agree. Well, guys, that is our coil video. And honestly, now that I think about it, like you mentioned fetus a lot. I, if you're down to do another video in the future,
Always.
let's have how about we do that? How about we do them?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's we could probably do most of the catalog in one video because he hasn't done a huge amount. He's kind of gone on and done, soundtracks and other things like that. So I'm definitely think we could do a features video and get a lot out of that for sure.
Yeah,
Um,
because
it,
like
it
yeah.
equally, if anybody watching would like us to do anything in particular, you know, shout us what you'd like to see, because I personally really enjoy doing these videos, and it gets me listening to music I've either not listened to before or haven't listened to for a while, and that is a good thing. So
Yeah, like this us deciding to do this, like when you suggested Coil, I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna force myself to like,
yeah,
listen to some Coil because like I'm still a regular person. I got other things I'm doing. Like I sometimes I just don't always feel like listening to new music because it's
yeah,
just like I have to really attune myself. But when you have a foundation like these videos that we're doing, it's like it helps you, really stay focused and hone in. And I
agreed,
think honestly, this actually keeps me stable throughout
agreed.
my life because like it's bringing me back to the reason why I loved listening to music in the first place. So it's just like, all right, if I want to listen to new music, it's kind of like an assignment. I feel like doing these videos, it's like,
Yeah,
all right, research this band, look at these few albums, and first thesis statement
yeah,
about it just based off of video, and then after
yeah,
that it'll just be easier like because like you solidified it and there's
yeah,
documented history of it. And
definitely.
I feel like besides doing album reviews, which is how I started this channel, I'm just like, what, I feel like album reviews are like kind of somewhat dying. Like I still like them, but I feel like I kind of want it to be more personal, where it's like
Sure,
actually diving into it like for a few months and telling your experience. I feel like that's the most purest form of how I really want to talk about music because
definitely.
I'm not trying to go into it with an objective of like, this is good, this is how it should sound. It's like, no, I just want to express my absolute feelings
Yeah.
about what I felt going into it.
In a way, I feel I've shot myself in the foot by calling my channel a post-punk podcast, because there are so many bands outside of that that I would love to talk about more. So I need to have a rethink on that one. But no, I agree. These videos have been great. And as long as you're happy to, I'm happy to keep making them.
Yeah, honestly, this is kind of all I really want my channel to be at this point because I'm gonna be too busy like in the future to like do YouTube consistently like I
Yeah,
want. And I really wasn't even from the beginning. Like I'll take 2, 3 months off and then just a video. But I just want this channel to just be like a little safe haven where I'm like, I can just talk about music for fun and like not really
yeah,
have to worry about, having YouTube be a substantial like income, which
yeah,
again, if it happens, cool. But I really made this channel in the mindset of like how YouTube started out in the mid 2000s. It's like something I just felt
yeah,
like doing because it
yeah.
was fun.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So it took a lot for me to like kind of like put my pride down of like wanting this to be like a big channel. Like
Yeah,
even though I did want to like review obscure music. So I was going into it very niche like anyway,
yeah,
but I thought like, oh cool, I'll just go to shows to like get more views. But at the same time, it's just like it felt so empty. Yeah, after a while, it's just like I'm just still following the same model, just in a different way, where it's just like just whenever I feel like making a video, whenever you're available, and we'll talk about it.
yeah.
And that's
Definitely,
how I really want to keep it.
definitely. And that's the best way to do it. That's the punk way.
Punk. Yes.
Yeah.
All
So
right. You guys have a nice day. Jonathan, thank you again. And
excellent.
we shall continue in the future, probably with Fetus.
See you later, everybody.
See you then.